Thanks for the intro. I'm Seth. I work at Google now, but the work I'm talking about I actually did independent of my work at Google before I worked at Google. And this was I actually did my undergraduate at Stanford, so it's always fun coming back. I studied philosophy, not computer science or electrical engineering, and then I did my PhD at Harvard in economics, and I was kind of lost, I think, on what to write about and not really sure what to do. And then I discovered this tool, Google Trends, online. Somebody told me about it. And I'm like, wow, this is incredible, because I kind of had spent 6 years, 5 years learning about data and learning about all the weaknesses of data and learning that a lot of things that we thought were very well thought out are based on small samples of people, where 5% of people answer the phone and people lie to these surveys and all this stuff. And I'm like, wow, Google is this incredible data source. I kind of think maybe the most incredible, if you look at people's Google searches, maybe the most incredible data source we've ever had on the human psyche. All the data is anonymous and aggregate, of course. So that's obviously important. And kind of since then, I did my whole dissertation, I called it Essays Using Google Data. And it was kind of 3 ways that we could use Google searches to measure something that's otherwise hard to measure. So I'll talk about some of that research now. So Google Trends is this source. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you may not. More and more people are becoming familiar with it. But you can go with it. It's a little addictive if you do go to it. You can kind of play around and see what people are searching in different countries, in different parts of the United States through time, etc. And one of the things that you'll immediately find out when you play around with Google Trends is that it correlates very strongly with kind of what you think or what it should mean. So this is searches that include the word Jewish, the percentage of searches that include the word Jewish in different states of the United States. If you know anything about the Jewish population, which I'm kind of an expert on for obvious reasons, it's very high in New York. And actually this has an R squared. About 88% of the variance in the Jewish population can be explained by this map, what percent of the time people search for Jewish. Compare that to Mormon search rate. Very different, obviously very, very concentrated in one state in particular, and then a second state, Idaho, has a little bit more, and this R squared is about 0.99 with the Mormon population, which is very concentrated in these areas. And I think a few points kind of stand out when you see these maps. One of them is, I think we talked about biases in searches. I think people are kind of surprised to think of searches as a measure of something. It's a survey. We're kind of comfortable asking somebody, are you a Mormon? Are you Jewish? To kind of say from your searches, are we going to measure something? It's a little weird. You could think of this as searches that include the word Mormon. That also includes searches for Book of Mormon, which is a Broadway play by the South Park guys. And yet, kind of even though we have these biases, it is kind of incredible over and over. You see really, really strong patterns despite that. And kind of the data can kind of get over these other issues and really see the predominant use of a search and really reveal clear patterns. And I think one of the things that is very, very clear when you start just thinking about intuition or looking through the data or a lot of other reasons is there's kind of this big advantage of Google search data, and that's this issue of social desirability bias. So people will lie to surveys if you ask them, or mislead surveys. They don't really have an incentive to tell the truth. So if you ask people, how do we know people lie? Well, sometimes you can compare it to the ground truth. So you ask people, are you going to vote in the election, or even immediately after the election, did you vote? And something like 80% of the country will say, sure, I voted a week ago. They don't want to admit that they didn't vote, and we actually we have administrative records. We know how many people voted, and 80% of Americans did not vote. Something like 50% of people who don't vote are going to tell a survey they vote. So when you think about that, you kind of have big issues with surveys, and you're not getting the honesty. Well, Google is kind of like this ideal platform for getting honest answers. So the way that you get honest answers, the best chances we have, even with surveys, is have people alone and online. You tend to be a lot more honest. You're not talking to someone. And then Google takes it a step further. You're not really in a survey. You actually have an incentive, like to look something up. You really want to tell the truth and want to tell the truth. And again, of course, the privacy implications here. Obviously, this data has to be anonymous and aggregate if we're going to be using data on people on these sensitive topics. But I think that's a real advantage of Google searches. So this first study I did is, so after the election, if you remember the 2008 presidential election, one of the issues was, would race play a role in Obama's election? The first African-American candidate ever. It was a big question. And if you go back, actually, the stories immediately after the election, there were stories like Gallup, race not important to voters. And, something like they had surveyed every voter and, 99+% of voters said that race was not a factor in their vote. But this is kind of an area, if you think what is an area where people might not want to admit something, this is kind of one of the areas. This is a sensitive area in American culture today. So what I did is I measured racist search rates in 2004, from 2004 to 2007 in 200 media markets in the United States. So I have to use kind of strident language for this part of the talk if you can think what is a racist search. So I just did the very simplest thing. I did what percent of Google searches include the racist word nigger, which if you actually you look at the searches, about 20% of these searches are for jokes, and you look at the returns, you kind of see very, very racist searches, and it's a surprisingly common search. It's about 7 million searches in the United States every year with the term, about as common as like searches for migraine or economist, very common, kind of things that are not rare searches by any stretch of the imagination. And you actually can get kind of a map. This is for media markets, again, anonymous aggregate data. This is where it's searched more frequently in places like West Virginia, Western Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, Southern Mississippi, Louisiana. Actually kind of a surprising map in some ways. If you had asked me where is racism highest in the United States, I would have said it's South versus North. And when you actually look at this map, it's more like East versus West in some sense. Like lots of pockets like upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio are higher on racism, and Appalachia is a lot higher than kind of South. So it's an interesting map. Right off the bat, this isn't. There's also a word nigga that ends in a that is used in rap songs. If you look at that, it's a very different map, and that's so a lot of people think, well, isn't that just a rap word? Wouldn't that be why people are searching it? But that's not it.
I don't want to derail your talk, but it seems there's at least 3 dimensions. There's shades of color, there's distortion of size, and there's clearly lines that mark off governmental areas or something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is. I keep on meaning to change this map and keep on procrastinating on that. It should be a nicer map. These are media markets, so they're basically defined by Nielsen for advertising purposes. It's groups of counties. There's a couple confusing things. White is I don't have data on. So there are like a few very white things. Darker red is higher search volume, search rates, and lighter red is lower search rates. And yeah, I apologize. I should have boundaries and stuff, which would probably make this a little clearer. But so it's normalized by Google searches, which is probably better than normalizing by population. So it's percent of Google searches.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to.
Because there's the Yahoo versus Google search density map, which is different too.
Right. So I mean, that's why you'd want to do normalized by Google searches, not normalized by population, right? So if you normalize by population, you might be biased by some areas use Google less, or even just use the internet less. So, but you can also do a lot of controls for stuff. It's pretty clear that these are the areas. So, well, how are we going to use this to calculate how much racism cost Obama? So what I do is we can compare. We don't have. So Obama ran in 2008. In 2004, John Kerry ran, a white candidate. So the simplest thing, and there are lots of more advanced things I do, is just compare how did Obama do to Kerry. What was kind of the difference in the vote total? And of course, on average, Obama did better than Kerry. Obama won, Kerry lost. But you can see in places where there's low racially charged search rate, Obama does about 8 or 9 percentage points better than Kerry. And in places with the highest racially charged search rate, Obama actually does worse than Kerry. And this is from social science perspective. I mean, you guys might be, I don't know, in computer science, electrical engineering, you probably have like very strong relationships. In social science, things are very noisy. This is a strong relationship from social science perspective. And then you do things, well, is there some other reason that Obama does worse than Kerry in areas with high racially charged search rates? You start controlling for other variables. You control for education levels. You control for racial demographics. You control for a lot of other things. And basically, this remains a very, very strong predictor and robust relationship. There's also some more advanced things you can do. So one thing I also looked at is I originally wrote this paper in 2011, but then 2012 we had this other election. So you can compare Obama minus Obama. And they're kind of like, you can kind of think that if this was spurious, then maybe this relationship would continue, or like it would regression to the mean. But if you do Obama minus Obama, it's flat with respect to racially charged search rate, which I think is also convincing. Another thing I do is I compare House voting over this time period and Senate voting, and you don't see any relationship. So Democrats weren't like losing support in areas with high racially charged search rate over this period. So what this I think shows me is that basically racism cost Obama a lot of the vote. I think about 3 to 5% of the vote in both the 2008 and 2012 election. And this is significantly higher than you would see in a survey, which tend to say that Obama lost only about 1 to 2% of the vote. And again, I think this really does, to hammer home this point, show the power of Google searches, where if you ask people, a significant percentage of people who probably were unfortunately moved by racism against supporting Obama would not say that this was a motivation. So, are there any questions on this study before I move on to other ones? So another thing that's I think very useful for Google searches, and it's also kind of similarly motivated. So I talked about how people tend to mislead about voting. They say they're going to vote even when they actually have no intention to vote, or they might think they're going to vote, but they actually aren't. So I wanted to see, can we predict who's going to vote based on Google searches? And the motivation for this is whether when you're actually going to vote, you actually might have to look up information. You might have to look up where to vote or how to vote or register to vote or early vote or lots of other things. So I simply just measured searches for vote in October of an election year compared to 4 years earlier. And then I wanted to see if searches for vote have gone up in an area, does that predict that turnout's going to go up in that area as well? And what do you find? That yes, there's a strong relationship that areas of the country that search for vote a lot in October tend to increase their turnout. So you can predict turnout through this vote search. This is comparing the Google vote searches in 2008, in 2004 and 2008, so the presidential election. And then this is trying to predict turnout in the midterm election. It's an even stronger relationship. So in the midterm election, turnout's a big issue. A lot of people don't vote in midterm elections. But basically what this is saying is that if Google vote searches are high in October in a place before a midterm election, or higher than they were 4 years ago, you can expect turnout to go up. One of the things that's kind of surprising here is that if you look at when voting when these searches have the most predictive power, it tends to be like early to mid-October. I would have guessed it would be like last second vote, but it's kind of interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that people it seems like people make their decisions a lot earlier of whether or not they're going to vote. And then I also predicted this is the 2008 to 2012 election. This was a little bit complicated by Hurricane Sandy, which actually I meant to give this talk. I was invited to give this talk by Dennis Ellison before. I actually couldn't give this talk because of Hurricane Sandy, and it also kind of messed up my analysis, which is kind of interesting. But some of the outliers are due to Hurricane Sandy, but it's still a pretty good predictive power. So I think in general, this is really a good use of search data as prediction. So a lot of times you might have kind of read about Google flu, and that's kind of similarly motivated, that it takes a while to get the information on from the government sources on flu, and you can, by seeing like people search flu symptoms or cough, fever, you can actually beat those by a few days. So this is kind of an exciting area because the Google search data we get basically the next day, whereas government sources or other sources might take a few weeks or even in some cases months or years.
Do you expect the same thing with regard to Ebola?
Yeah, so Ebola is kind of an interesting one. Google flu is actually interesting for a number of reasons. So you might have also seen that Google flu kind of fell apart. People are really excited that you could predict the flu with Google searches, and then about a year ago, there were a lot of news stories about a flu epidemic that didn't come true. And because of the news stories, people were searching for it, and it kind of became self-fulfilling. And Google really overestimated how much flu there was. So that's interesting. I think Ebola would run into a similar problem, possibly, where a lot of the searches are for news stories about Ebola. So the question is, can you see, can you kind of cut between that? I think it's kind of interesting. I've kind of found that using Google searches tends to require like more creativity than usual data sources. Because survey, you kind of know what to do. You ask people, do you have Ebola or do you have this? Kind of going through the search data and figure out what search suggests that someone has Ebola is not a simple thing to do. And you always kind of run into issues and and wording. I mean, the other thing is we're trying to predict unemployment, and we had all these great searches that predicted unemployment, and then Steve Jobs died, and a lot of our searches were related to jobs, and everyone says, oh no, unemployment. Everyone's looking for work all of a sudden. No, it's Steve Jobs died. So you run into kind of all kinds of issues. It's not a perfect data set by any stretch of the imagination, but I think the advantages are very strong that it's worth thinking through those issues and think about how you can deal with them.
Can you take random samples out of the queries that have jobs in them? Are you allowed to do that?
Yeah, so what do you mean random samples?
A random sample. There's 89,000 queries with the word jobs in it. Show me a random one that allows me to estimate these things.
You mean a random one to see like what % of them have different words? I don't think you can do that. You can kind of play around and figure out like what % have a certain type of words or what % have Steve in them or stuff like that. But you can't just get. So there are a lot of, as you can imagine, privacy
Yes, I see now.
concerns. So it's not simple, but it could be. It could be another thing that like people at Google Flu are talking about is maybe what we can do. And this I thought was really interesting. Is let's say you do a search for like flu symptoms. Let's give you a survey right after you made that and say, do you or your family member have flu? And then you can see over time, is that relationship changing? So let's say all of a sudden news stories become the big reason that people are searching for flu symptoms. Then the % of surveyed people who say they have flu goes way down. And right away we'll see, oh no, our relationship doesn't work anymore. We got to change the model. So I thought that's really promising. And I think in general, we're working a lot on actually at Google, some connecting surveys to search data, anonymous and aggregate. But I think that's going to be really powerful in the future is like try to take the advantages of surveys that we're actually asking a question and like we know what we're looking for, but try to connect them to the advantages of searches, which are like they're big samples in small geographic areas and over time. But again, like, at the geographic level, so it's anonymous and aggregate.
Are you attempting to build trained correlators, which basically search the space of indicators for the lexicon of search terms to correlate against a trend based on ground truth?
Yeah, so that's what Google Flu was initially, and again, it's so there are a few complications here. So there's a question like ground truth is one issue. So it's great when you have ground truth. That's a good thing for prediction. It's also interesting when you don't have ground truth like Ebola or like voting or like racism. And I think, I don't want to give up in those areas because I think there is a lot of power, but it's kind of becomes a more interesting, like more difficult question. Well, we don't have any ground truth. Well, what do we, but we still think there's information here. What do we do? But there's a tool that you might have or may not have seen that's called Google Correlate, which is basically you put any time series or state variation data set into Google Correlate, and it'll tell you the search terms that correlate highest with that, like the 100 search terms that correlate highest with that. And then what we found is actually doing that and then using a machine learning approach to try to pick between them is actually pretty powerful. So first you kind of limit the space, and then you use like machine learning to try to predict that. But I think you're right. I think voting, like the voting example, is a little hard because we have so few examples. You have an election every 4 years. But if you have something that happens like every week, and you have thousands of observations to predict from, then using some of these machine learning techniques and cross-validation and everything to try to pick your terms is powerful. I think, but I definitely think that one of the issues you're always going to run into is changes in search behavior, that people are going to start, like you have something like looking for a job, and that's a great predictor of unemployment. And then someone writes a rap song called "Looking for a Job," and everyone searches for looking for a job, and you're no longer predicting unemployment. So it's like it's a lot of like really interesting, sometimes humorous issues, but it's kind of like, well, how do you deal with them? And it might be like connecting surveys or something with it, or somehow kind of training a model to somehow be able to pick that the relationship is now changing.
Does Google Correlate also deal with lead lag estimation? In other
Yeah.
words, so it not only the correlation strength, but if there are any phase delays.
If there are any what?
Phase delays.
Yeah, so you can do like a week. You can push it back a week or push it forward a week. We're also finding though that there are some issues with seasonality becomes a big issue.
So it doesn't do time-weighted correlation?
No, not. Yeah, we're kind of trying.
It's not using spectral methods.
No, so we're trying to like kind of change that to make it more advanced. It was kind of like this was kind of the first attempt, and it is pretty cool. But we do want to do more advanced things and some of these things you're talking about. So yeah.
When you say search terms, do you mean that I mean, one example is it multi-word things? Can I say, I have the flu, what are flu cures?
Yeah.
That's more interesting than the news about the flu, which is the query itself disambiguous.
Yeah, so you can do any query like that. You can do more advanced queries. I think those tend to be rarer. Like I think even people with the flu, they tend to probably not search like I have the flu. So you lose some signal, but you lose some noise as well. So it's kind of a trade-off. I think the future models, it might be that we had some wrong things, but a lot of things like that you would think that people like flu symptoms, you would think that's a pretty good one, but it seemed to be like driven by news as well. So.
Did you look at what they clicked on?
Not in the initial model. That's another thing in the future model that might be better. It also gets to like, so it's kind of interesting also that initially when the model fell apart, or I don't want to say fell apart. It was a first model, and I think as probably we all know, first models, it's good to have first models and then iterate from there. So I think we're trying to.
It's not time to publish yet.
What?
It's just not time to publish.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've lost my train of thought. So flu symptoms. Result click. No, I wasn't going to say that. Maybe that we're going to add clicks. So after it happened, there become at some point existential questions, because people say, well, how do we know the ground truth is right? Maybe the Google searches are right. Maybe if someone types I have the flu but doesn't go to a doctor, or doesn't get recorded by the doctor, then at some point it's not clear. It's not always clear that people, because Google searches are new, they tend to want to see it beat a ground truth or match a ground truth. But some of these ground truths, when you see how the sausage is made, it's always there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of things that don't always totally pan out. So then the final one is child maltreatment. And so there's a question of what happens to child maltreatment when economic conditions go right. This is basically child abuse. So what happens, how does child abuse respond to economic hardship? So what you can see is, the Great Recession, basically some parts of the country, Nevada, Arizona, had big increases in unemployment, and some parts of the country, North Dakota, Alaska, were largely unaffected by the economic condition. So did child maltreatment rise or fall in the places that were hard hit by the recession? And when you actually look at the official data, you see that it goes down in places where unemployment goes up, which is surprising. You would have thought that unemployment goes up, people are depressed, a lot of alcohol consumption, like a lot of trouble, hardship, stress is going to increase child maltreatment. It actually says it goes down. Well, what I think actually happened, and I'm going to show you using Google search and some other forces, is it didn't go down. People just stopped reporting it for various reasons. And actually, you see stories that basically the social services were cut. A lot of times you were getting stuck online. You couldn't get through to people, and you couldn't actually report it. Also, a lot of teachers and first responders they lost their jobs, so they were maybe a little more overwhelmed, and you can think of some other reasons. So the first clue that this isn't really right, that this is saying that in places where unemployment goes up, child maltreatment actually went down, is you look at, instead of all child abuse cases, you just look at child fatalities from neglect, and these are rarer, so it's not as powerful an indicator. But these kind of have to be reported. You can't, if a kid, something as tragic as a death happens, people are gonna, it has to be reported. So this actually is completely the opposite. It goes up, but you can see it's kind of a noisy relationship because it's kind of sparse data. So the second thing I was thinking is, well, this is one clue, but what about Google searches? So there are millions of searches every year for child abuse, and kind of the way I think of this is almost like a poll without actually taking a poll, whereas you might see something like that doesn't look right, and you're kind of going to look, is this child abuse signs or something like that, whether or not you actually go through and report it. So that's kind of one way we can look at it, and you see that actually it's just like the fatality data, but actually this is a lot stronger data because it's a lot bigger samples, is it goes way up in places that were hit by the recession. So I think, and I kind of looked at the data the other way, what actually happened is really a lot sadder than what we thought happened. Is instead of, we thought the recession, the official data says no, the recession, child abuse went down. What actually happened is it went up, but people just, because of these budget cuts and some other reasons, people stopped reporting it. And then there's also really, this kind of almost getting to yours, like you actually search something. There's actually really tragic, and this is sad, obviously, like really sad, but actually these are a lot rarer, but kids actually do search, dad hit me or mom hit me, or, dad beat me. When you actually do search like this, these were going down right until the recession, and then right when the recession hits, these types of searches start going up. So you actually see kids, it's really sad, the contrast that kids are actually searching things like this, and you actually see in the official data that the reports of them are going down. So, which all this is anonymous and aggregates.
Norway has an ombudsman for children, okay, and it's obvious that this data, we do need ground truth with respect to this particular data, and misestimation of the data, which is to say, could have its own consequences. Is there a possibility that Google could initiate, even though it's not an official governmental office, an ombudsman for children so that you can get this data?
Yeah, so after I did this, I talked to some people within Google and also at child maltreatment clinics, and they're kind of like, what can we do? And I kind of also don't want to be like, this is a first model, I don't want to be like, but also it's such an important issue that's I think we're also talking about, I don't think we want to just say this is child maltreatment index and say here's a black box and we say it. We're more interested in here are the types of searches, and then researchers can kind of build their models off of that. So it might not be Google internally is going to say, here's what's happening to children, but actually if we can give this data to scientists and researchers and child clinics, they can say, hey, what's going on? And so I talked to a lot of child maltreatment clinics, and there are lots of things even just the geographic breakdown, where incidents are highest, that they don't really know. So there are lots of things that I was kind of surprised. It's such an important issue that there are lots of things we don't know about it, that this is kind of an important area. And it's yeah, I think that's that's right on target. I think it's really, you do kind of run into these things where they are so important that you do want to say how can we don't want to just be a black box and say hey this, but how can we make sure that we're facilitating that, make sure that people know that that things are happening. It's Google runs into all these issues because it's such a big service. These moral questions. There was we don't like to say, Google doesn't like obviously to play around with searches. You want an algorithm and whatever happens. But then searches for suicide, someone said, wait, if someone's searching for something like suicide, Google's got to step in at some place here. So we realized that we could put a phone, a number for the suicide hotline, right on top of the search results, so people can see that right away if they're in a crisis. So and I think that's another one where you might say, well, maybe what we should have here is not just these answers from Yahoo Answers or something, but maybe we should have something that kids can learn what they're supposed to, really more official policy in a situation like this, because a lot of these kids, they're 13, 14 years old, they don't really know what necessarily, and do we want to leave it to Yahoo Answers and whatever for something like this, or some child services. We're also talking about potentially buying ads and stuff where they kind of explain to kids kind of in situations like this, and again, this is rare, thankfully, these types of searches, although part of the reason for that is because very young kids don't use computers and don't use Google, so it's only kind of, above a certain age where you're going to have this as being an indicator. But I think definitely moral issues are there, but I think we also want to, I think, I don't speak for Google, but I think, researchers can use this data themselves and hopefully, making this data as public as possible so that people can kind of, do their own models and do their own advanced models and kind of try to make sense of some of these issues. Because we do, I definitely think that there are a lot of important things here. There's, so it's kind of amazing, and I feel like this is because of my grad school background, but it's like, there are just so many things that are poorly measured. I mean, just crime in general, forget about, we don't really know. These crime data, they kind of come out, and it's, the fact is, first of all, a lot of people aren't reporting them to police. Second of all, police are sometimes, if you watch The Wire, police sometimes are playing around with these numbers a little bit. So the fact that, Google searches, when you think about it, might have some really other useful information on crime in areas, or even if you trust the data, just police might get better information about, different areas where crime is highest. So.
I'm a little concerned by the spread of the point clouds that are surrounding the lines you're fitting, which is to say, I mean, we could say sociologists have poor signal-to-noise ratio, but I'm pretty worried by what I'm seeing in terms of the figures that you've put up.
I think it depends. It depends on the question too. I mean, these are areas where, I think from sociology or economics, if you get a t-stat of 3 on a 50 sample, that's pretty big. This is not by any means rare for economists. There's a lot of things that go on in these situations.
Is that recommendation?
What?
That's not actually a recommendation.
What's that?
It's good compared to economists.
So I mean that is a little bit of a field issue. I think it also depends on the particular question. So if you do something like searches for unemployment office and compare that to unemployment rate, you're going to see a very, very strong relationship, way stronger than this. If you do, the first ones I started with, the searches for Jewish and searches for the Jewish population, you're going to see an R-squared of about 0.88. So that would be stronger than this. As far as I mean, I think, I don't think in the social sciences, we don't really see, if you're doing a question that's kind of difficult and might be a lot going on, we don't really usually see more than this. I do more things controlling for different things in the paper, and it doesn't really seem to change the results. But I think that might be partly that is a field issue where the social science isn't used to R-squareds that are that high. That's kind of how it works. So. Yeah, are there other questions? I'm kind of finished a little early, I think. So I guess basically what this says is that the official data says the Great Recession decreased child abuse. And I think the Google data combined with the mortality data say, I think, that actually the Great Recession probably increased child abuse, but led to decreased reporting of child abuse. And I think my conclusion is that anonymous aggregate Google searches, excellent new data for social scientists, and a lot of really interesting issues. I think so. I mean, this isn't a room of social scientists, so a lot of what I think computer scientists are doing are basically making this data usable for people like me who don't really know how to do the back-end stuff of getting rid of spam, and there are a million interesting questions behind the scenes that are going on to make this data at all useful for someone like me.
Have you tried trying to predict actual individual elections at the moment?
Yeah.
I check almost every day what the Senate races are. If there was something up on Google, I'd factor that into.
So right when I did this, everyone's like, Seth, why are you predicting turnout? Can't you predict the election? You have Google searches. So it's complicated. I have looked into it. So there's a complication, which is if you talk about, start with the presidential election. We'll get to Senate in a bit. So start with the presidential election. 90% of presidential elections are explained by, at the state level, what happened 4 years earlier. So it's a little hard to improve on that to get much signal. The other issue is that we've only had so many presidential elections with Google searches that you really risk fitting the signal to the, fitting your model and cheating a little bit. So you really want to somehow have out-of-sample tests and building models. So basically the first thing, everyone's just like, well, do searches for Obama predict, if Obama searched more than Romney, does that mean, Obama's going to do better than Romney in a state? And that really doesn't pan out. There are too many negative searches that include the word Obama. There are kind of some interesting things that do have predictive power, although like the R-squared is like 0.6, so it's not as high as polls, and it's kind of like not that great an impact, but they're kind of interesting. So if you look at searches for Obama Romney versus Romney Obama, places that search Obama Romney and go Obama, and you search Romney Obama, you go Romney. So it's like you're looking for the Obama Romney polls, you're probably an Obama supporter if that's how you call the kind of if that's how you kind of consider the election. So that was kind of interesting. The other one that was really interesting is if you look at Obama jokes, search rates for Obama jokes, that almost perfectly predicts votes for Romney. So basically, like if you're joking about someone, you probably don't like them. And I was thinking this kind of goes with like things that you follow. Like I was trying to get Google, instead of a favorability index, we'd have a jokeability index. So if you're joking about, the more you're joking about a candidate, you're not going to be able to support them. And then I think for the Senate, so the midterm elections for the Senate elections, one thing I didn't point out is that you actually can have predictive power just from turnout. So it turns out that Democrats depend on turnout way more than Republicans. Republicans kind of vote in pretty consistent numbers regardless of the election, but Democrats, they're kind of like younger and a little more fickle maybe. They're kind of maybe not. Some years yes, some years no. So if you actually look at areas where turnout's going to be high, you can expect the Senate Democrats can actually do better than the polls do, and I showed that. So that is one area where you can just use the turnout to say they're going to do better. And one thing I haven't tried that I think might have potential is if you look at Senate candidates or particularly House candidates, a lot of the issue is name favorability. People just literally don't know the candidate. If they know the candidate, that's probably a pretty good sign. So it might be interesting if you do we have 300 whatever House races. I want to check if you can actually predict how the House candidates are going to do just based on whether people are Googling for them. So that might actually do better than the Obama-Romney, because everyone knows Obama, everyone knows Romney. Kind of if you're searching, you might be searching, there's kind of different motivations. But so it's complicated. I think the bigger complication is honestly just we don't have enough elections that you test like 10 hypotheses, one's going to come true, but it's probably just going to be noise. So the more elections we have, we probably can say, hey, this really is predictive, and this really isn't predictive. So.
It seems to me that a lot of the stuff that you read is based on scientific nonsense. Example, racial classification. There's no basis for racial classification. It was made up several hundred years ago by Europeans in order to justify colonizing the rest of the world. They started out with the fantasy that Europe is a continent, which it isn't. There is one called Eurasia. But they pretended it was a continent, and therefore the people were different from the rest of the world. And this fantasy has been accepted by our media. Every day we get statistics of the number of blacks, whites, Asian, and so forth in various places. And all of that is based on fantasy classifications. Example, well, first of all, what do you do with mixed races? Most people classify Obama as black, even though it's half Eurasian. And there's all these statistics that we get that are pure nonsense. They arise in two ways. Sometimes people are asked to classify themselves, and they make up a fantasy of some sort and do that. But more often, somebody looks at them and classifies them. And that is pure nonsense. We're all mixtures of ancient tribes. And Most Europeans, of course, are part, all Europeans are part Neanderthal. I'm proud that I'm 2.6% according to my DNA. But the rest, it could all be put on a scientific basis based on DNA analysis, as I pointed out in an article 25 years ago. But nobody wants to do that. Instead, we keep making up statistics and publishing them as if they meant something. They don't. This is all. There's no ground truth in racial classification, and yet the newspapers are full of it.
Is that really the point? I mean, you say that Obama is only half black, but so it's wrong to call him black. But if the issue is you're trying to study racism effects, and if 100% of the country sees him as being black or at least non-white, I mean, what you're researching is correlations between public perception of different things.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Is this related to like my research, or just generally?
Generally, that this is a fantasy that our whole society indulges in. And
I mean, I think in general, I agree with you that like a lot of statistics that we take for face value, you see how the sausage is made, and there are a lot of questions that are worth asking for a lot of them. Yeah, I'm hoping that a lot of the new data sources do improve on that. I'm not an expert on this racial stuff, classification stuff, so I don't really know.
it could be nailed down if anybody really cared.
I mean, racial issues you also run into. There's so much for historical reasons. There's so much like sensitivity around them for obvious reasons. So like, like genetics and race, I think is pretty. People stay away from that, but
Yeah.
for like the question is, do we really want to know that or?
So you're running into the hidden power agenda variable in social sciences. In other words, people create sets of words and sophistry to legitimize a particular point of view.
Right.
So what do you do when you get powerful tools that head headlong into this land of controversy?
Yeah, I think you try to be careful, and I mean, I think to say that statistics are dangerous, like, yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't know if there's an easy answer. I feel like I'm trying to be careful in my research and not really, I probably have subtle biases, I'm sure, that play into the things that I'm saying, or the research results, or the questions that I ask. So, yeah, those are kind of broad questions. I don't really have a great answer, but yeah.
Interesting topics with a lot of potential, but I get the sense that at this stage you're sort of calibrating to what extent can these tools actually be used and how reliable are they? There's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy type thing that when you did an initial search trying to correlate child abuse with unemployment, the results were wrong, and so you looked at it more carefully and found some way of framing the search in such a way that it came out with the results you were expecting. So that seems like a...
Yeah, so I agree that this is something I didn't get too much into. So I think the most difficult issue with using Google searches is that there are so many potential searches that you can just cherry pick, and you find the one that gives you exactly what you want.
I mean, you learn from that experience, perhaps.
Yeah, so the thing that I try to do to avoid cherry picking is I start with kind of like the word, and I kind of feel like if you start with the word and you start with okay, like I could have said, if I came to you and said, hey, I found like one like racist thing, it's like I do not like African American people or something, like that was the search, and then it was like this proves against Obama, then you'd probably say, well, what about I don't like African American people, or I don't like black people, or like there are a million other searches, like how did you determine that was the one? Whereas if you start with kind of this big thing that searched more than everything else, and there's kind of the word, I think there's a little bit, I think, and I'm arguing that there's a lot less concern for that. I take that this is a big issue, and that a lot of the research, quite frankly, that I've seen with Google searches, I think is guilty of this issue, and says, we can predict the stock market by these 10 words, and it's kind of like, well, how did you choose those 10 words? Is this just noise? I think so. I mean it's the main issue with Google searches, and the approach I take is taking the most salient word. I think there are other approaches, like if you have a ground truth, you can actually like use an in-sample prediction and say what ones correlate the highest, and then use an out-of-sample prediction. So that's kind of another way to calibrate yourself. Yeah, those are. I think they're also like, let's say. So you start with like the most salient one, and then you say, well, what happens if you add like the second one, or add the third one, or add the fourth one? Does it change? I think is the other way to deal with it.
What about using semantic networks as the basis as opposed to word frequency? In other words, at a certain point, one wants to correlate against meaning, and so it makes sense to understand the phrase, and so you're busy trying to pick words. Natural language programming is quickly advancing from, word count, frequency, and proximity to operations on semantic graphs and correlations of semantic graphs. Not that I understand this science, but Google turns out to be on the leading edge of this.
Yeah, so I totally agree that this is like an exciting area, and just basically text as data. This is kind of just the broader point of text as data, which runs into this issue of how you deal with it. This is kind of done before some of those tools were advanced, I think, and there are other issues I didn't get to. So one of these issues you get is that like the N-word is searched so much more than any other racist thing that if you add anything else to it, you basically have the same measure, because it's just like, if you add anything else that's racist, you still have the same measure. So it's kind of like this one, it doesn't matter unless you don't include that word. So sometimes you're in sometimes you're not in that situation. Sometimes you have 50 choices, and they might be equally searched, and then maybe you need some of these tools to say, well, which ones do we include? But I think cherry picking is always an issue in social science, and I think cherry picking is more of an issue with Google searches, because you have these so many potential searches to choose from.
The cherry picking might even be generous in a way. I hadn't heard the Google flu thing before. I presume that has something to do with the fact that you're assuming flu frequency somehow correlates with the searches for the word flu. In the case of the Ebola virus, 100% of the people with Ebola are located in one precinct in Texas right now. So any correlation between that word and anything else would be false. I mean, there's so few people with Ebola that people looking for it are not in any way influenced by the number of people that have it in the country.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just also want to get back to one of the things you said is like kind of, you looked for, it seems like a lot of criticism I get in my research is this seems all very obvious, or like you found that, well, we all suspect that in a recession child abuse is going to go up, and it actually went down, so you're like, show that it went up. I think part of the reason is because these tools are not that advanced, where if you say something like new and explosive, and you're like, hey, Ebola is really high in Vermont or something like that, and then, you say something kind of like, so some of this is at the early stage where you're kind of just showing that this data actually is showing things we kind of already knew, but maybe from that we can start saying, well, what in these areas we really don't know and have no idea, what tools should we use to try to answer these questions?
One of the sort of surprising things to me is that how few, well, actually, let's say it a different way. How do you get more ground truths than that? You mentioned the possibility that alcohol might have something to do with child abuse. That's a measurable ground truth, because you can look at tax receipts for alcohol taxes. And you're in Google, so shouldn't you have a lot of ground truths just sort of laying around that you could be popping in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, just social scientists in general, I don't think.
Well, but social science at Google is not social science in general.
Yeah.
You should have a lot more data just sitting around just because that's what you do.
Yeah, so I mean, there are also like privacy issues. I don't, yeah, I think.
But there's no privacy data for alcohol consumption.
Yeah, there shouldn't be. Yeah, so I think.
There's a ton of statistics in the world, and you're no longer a grad student trying to do 5 things using SPSS. You've got the Googleplex, in some sense, working for you.
All right. Yeah, thanks. I had thought about it.
Wolfram is also trying
yeah.
Yeah, so he's trying to like put everything together, and
So is Google licensing Wolfram's data sets? No,
I don't think so. Not that I know of. I don't know.
it's not a two-way street.
So his data sets are like I think publicly available, or he's purchasing them. So I think so. But yeah, I think just in general, just forget Google. Like yeah, like Google's a big company. Like just in general, like there's data that's exploding all over the place, and it's kind of like a really exciting time to be a social scientist, and also kind of a scary time because like all these issues you're talking about, like cherry picking and stuff like that, we kind of don't really know what we're doing with all this data, but it's like exploding at a rate that we've never really seen before, with all these new like basically online sources or digital sources where like things are recorded, anonymous and aggregate data.
So it sounds like the curse of dimensionality is basically eating you alive. In other words, in the end, you actually aren't going to be able to figure these things out when you realize how many degrees of freedom in the measurement are possible, and the small number that you are actually entertaining.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think that. I think the things that I've shown, I'm pretty confident that are truly there in the data. I think there's also, when you're trying to predict something, and you have 1,000, 3,000 observations, you actually will see with like Google Correlate that the things that pop up are very, very reasonable, and you're not kind of dying from the curse of dimensionality. So I don't think you can't say anything because of that. I just think that you have to be careful, and that I think that a lot of the things that I read, I am skeptical of. When they tell you that, I think someone wrote a paper. It was based on like Twitter data, and they said that from tweets, like if there's anxiety 3 days prior, the stock market's going to go down. And when you read something like that, you're kind of like, really, like how many possibilities are there that include anxiety 3 days before, and why should we expect that at all? So I think in those situations, definitely like a healthy amount of skepticism is necessary. But I definitely don't think that eliminates the possibility of saying anything.
So how many people are there doing this sort of work? And what fraction of them work for political parties?
It depends how you define this sort of work. So Google Trends was like surprisingly underutilized, which is why I wrote my thesis on it. I'm like, why isn't everybody like obsessed with this data? Like it seems so awesome. But I mean, quote unquote big data in general, and that's like an issue that's like important for social sciences is that's growing very, very fast. So people are becoming a lot more interested in some of these digital data sources to try to learn them. And the Obama campaign, like obviously was using a lot of these new tools and a lot of these huge data sets to try to understand political behavior. So I think big data, I think this is kind of considered big data, even though I only use like 100 observations or 200 observations. There's big data that computer scientists and electrical engineers turn into small data for people like me. So it is kind of big data, but that's kind of what people are talking about. And that's like a really, really hot field where, but I think there's a lot of just uncertainty. It's not like people don't know exactly what we're doing or what people should do with these data sets, except that everyone kind of has an instinct that there is a lot to learn in here. And I think from the things I've shown, people might disagree that there actually are insights in this data. And that I would defend these things I found pretty strongly if someone disagreed with the findings. So,
can you say you're allowed to or not allowed to or whatever? What do you see as being the goal of your department? Trying to develop tools that the world at large could use, or are you trying to find trends that Google might use internally?
So sorry for the confusion. So this is basically a talk I was agreed to give before I even came to Google. So this is basically research I've done outside my work at Google. This is not like Google's work or anything. This is my own work. Yeah. No, I understand.
Google represents a whole lot of
So I don't speak. I think I could just say that I think people at Google are interested in how social scientists might use their data. I don't think they're trying to like create internally like a social science department or anything, because I think they think I think social science is better when it's done by the scientific community and it's external and very like transparent and stuff. So I don't think so. All this stuff I've been showing you is all publicly available. You could just go online, like reproduce all this stuff yourself. So I don't think the work I do at Google is really separate. None of this stuff, all this stuff was done before I got to Google and outside Google. The work I do for Google is really separate and from this stuff. So It's just I think I have an expertise in this area, so they're kind of like, well, you understand our data so well, you probably should work here. So yeah.
We done? Yay.
Good.